All right, guys, now that we know how to read this graph and how to read this metric, we're going to see or dive into how to use the percent of first pivots more than X% away from daily open, so this metric, to determine the likelihood of P1 holding. A couple of announcements before we do. First of all, what I forgot to say is that in these tutorials, we'll be talking solely about the daily time frame, but all the logic that we discuss in all these tutorials will apply to the other time frames as well. So if you understand how the daily time frame works, you will understand how the weekly time frame works: 8 hour, 4 hour, 1 hour. So for example, if you go to the weekly time frame, you will see that everything looks the same. It's just it's the same logic, but in this case we're using P1 day and P2 day instead of P1 hour and P2 hour. So if for simplicity, we're just going to talk about the daily time frame, but if you know how to use the daily time frame, you're going to know how to use the weekly 8 hour, 4 hour, and 1 hour. Second of all, what I want to say is that this is one of the main use cases we have found. Well, the main use case of using this data. Maybe you will find another use case. So what I want to say is that that I'm going to explain this is the way we use it doesn't mean that there's not other ways of using it. But this is the main way we are using it, but maybe you can be creative and find another way you want to use it. But that's up to you. So let's dive into actually how we're going to use this metric to determine the likelihood of P1 holding. Now, the main use case of this metric is, as said, the likelihood of P1 holding for the rest of the day. And paradoxically, to do so, we're going to look at the current distance from the daily open to the current P2. So if we go to the chart, so what we would take is this distance to determine how likely is P1 going to hold. Now, that might be confusing to some people. Like, the questions that arise is, what does the distance between the daily open and P2 have to do with it? Aren't we looking at data for distances between daily open and P1, not the distance between daily open and P2? And yes, these are all valid points. Again, this shows the distances from daily open to first pivot, right? Not to P2, to first pivot. And the reason we're doing this is because we're going to derive the estimated probability of P1 holding by looking at how likely it is that a P1, P2 flip will occur. And the best way to show this here, if we know there's a low probability for P1, P2 flip to occur, so for this to occur, right, we have the P1 here, we have the P2 there for the P1, P2 flip, we'd have to see this. So if we know there's a low probability for this P1, P2 flip to occur, then we know there's a high probability that P1 will hold, right? Low probability of the flip means high probability P1 will hold. That's a logical conclusion you can derive from that. And to do that, we're going to look at the current distance of daily open to P2, or we're going to look at the chances of P2 becoming P1. So what we're going to ask ourselves is, how unlikely is it that P2 will become P1? The less likely it is for P2 to become P1, the more likely it is that P1 will hold. So again, the only thing we're trying to do here is determine how likely it is that P1 will hold, right? We're only concerned about this. We're not trying to see if this goes further, if P2 gets taken out. We're trying to see what's the likelihood of P1 holding. We're going to go into P2 holding in a later video. So first, to understand how this works, I want you to think of price as energy. Now I'm gonna draw this chart. So you see, the further away price moves from daily open, the less likely it is to P1. And we have alluded to this in the earlier video, where you can see it just becomes less probable to put in P1 the further away you get from daily open. And the reason this works, in my opinion, is that price is energy, right? The further price moves from daily open, the more energy is required. And significant moves are less common because they need more energy. That also means that the further away from daily open the current P2 is, the more energy is required to reverse and make a P1, P2 flip, right? Because you need, if you have here, for example, or let's draw it in the charts, if you start here, so price goes and then has the energy to go all the way here, and this is pretty rare to go here and then go back, so to say, for that, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So it needs energy to get here, and then for the P1, P2 flip to occur, you need even more energy to get back, right? Because then this becomes P1, this gets taken out, and you need that energy to first go here and then go here. But for now, the most important thing is that, price is energy. So the further away we get from daily open, the further away from daily open the current P2 is, the more energy is required to reverse and make a P1, P2 flip. What we are going to do with the dashboard is quantify the probability or the frequency of such a reversal happening. So again, what we're talking about is the reversal. So the further away this gets, less likely it is, the more energy is needed for this to happen. We're going to quantify that probability, right? Again, the further it gets, the less likely it is for P2 or for a P1 to be put in. And again, for that P1 to be put in, you have to, here's the P2, and for this to become P1, this needs to happen, right? The P1, P2 flip. So first of all, the recommended settings for this are input mode P2 automatic. What this does is simply that it takes the current distance from P2 and plugs it in as an input value, right? And I don't want to talk about it too much because I will discuss this in the video after this. And if you're wondering why you're doing after this, because this is enough to get the point across of how this works. But for now, all you need to know is that it will take the current distance from daily open to current P2, and we can see it's negative 1.7%, which we've seen in previous videos. So we can see, looking at Ethereum right now. So let's switch to Bitcoin, and then we can see that indeed it will be a distance of negative 1.7% right there. So what it does is plug this in right here. You can see here now this chart is being calculated, the formatting, and this is being this input's being taken. That's what P2 automatic is doing. Again, I will have a video on this later, but for now what you need to know is that it takes the current distance from daily open to the current P2. So this distance, just based on current price action. And the next setting you want to do is filter mode automatic. These are the recommended settings: input mode P2 automatic and filter mode automatic. What filter mode automatic does is not important yet, but this is how I recommend using it, and we'll dive into the filter mode automatic in a subsequent video to explain further why it is, what exactly it's filtering on. It's filtering the data to make it more accurate, but for now it's not very important yet to realize what exactly is happening. So now that we have our settings, we're going to dive into some examples to see how this works. So we know that the further away price moves from daily open, the less likely it is to become P1. Now I've already went ahead and created some examples because it will be easier to do it this way. So for example, we have here a Bitcoin, and on a certain day we had P2 2.09% above the daily open. So the daily open was here, and price moved to 2.09% away from or above the daily open. Now, mind you that the daily close is here, so this is somewhere in the middle of the day. We see P2 is at hour 8. What we see here is a metric value of 21%. So a metric value does 21% of the first pivots are more than 2.09% away from the daily open, right? So that doesn't happen a lot. So we can see that 79% of daily P1s get put in less than 2% away, 2.09% above daily open, and thus 21% of daily P1s get put in further away than that, which means that only 21% of days manage to put in a P1 that far from daily open. So let's reiterate something. In case you are confused as to why we're looking at the distance between daily open and P2 and plotting it against data that shows the distances between daily open and P1, remember that we are trying to estimate the likelihood of a P1, P2 flip. And I know I just said it, but I'm repeating, so we're trying to estimate this likelihood. I know I just said it, but I'm repeating myself because it's very important to understand. So effectively, if price were to take out the daily low from here and finish the P1, P2 flip, then that would make the current daily high to be the daily P1, right? And we can see that more in here. So if this were to happen, right? If this were to happen, then we have that P1, P2 flip. That means that now this is P1, right? So this is now P2, but it can become P1, right? We know this. P2 can become P1. P1 can never become P2, but P2 can become P1. We've covered this in the fundamental videos, the earlier videos. But so if this happens, then that would mean that only 21% of daily P1s got put in further away from the daily open, or that 21% of days made it that far, right? So this is the thing we're trying to estimate, the likelihood of that P1, P2 flip. You have to remember this. So we now know that only 21% of days pull such a move off, because only 21% of days have been able to move as far from daily open to put into P1 before reversing and taking out the other side, right? So before reversing and taking out this side. Therefore, we can derive the probability of the P1, P2 flip happening from this metric. Considering that we know only 21% of days put in a P1 that far from daily open, right? Because this is important to understand. Price is energy. So only, another way to interpret this is that only 21% of days had a P1 that made it this far from daily open, right? Because only 21% of days made it this far. That's why 21% of days are above this level. Only 21% of days had a P1 that got put in this far from daily open or further away. So we know it's only 21% of days it happens that it comes this far or further. So now that we know this, we can derive the probability of a P1, P2 flip. And again, I say derive and infer, these are important words, we're going to get to that, but we can infer the probability of P1, P2 flip happening is low. And such a move happens approximately 1 out of every 5 days, right? 21%, so this would happen only 1 every 5 days. And this is where everything comes together. Remember that we stated at the start of this tutorial, if we know there is a low probability of a P1, P2 flip occurring, so if we know there's a low probability for this P1, P2 flip to occur, then we know there's a high probability that P1 will hold. So we go back to this. Since we derive there is a low probability of the P1, P2 flip occurring, we conclude that the most likely scenario for today would be to P1 to hold. Again, because only 21% of days put in the P1 this far from daily open or further. Therefore, we can conclude that this is a rare occurrence. And therefore, we can say, well, it's probably a low probability that P1 will hold. And, we can see what happened after, and we can see that indeed P1 held. We also took out P2, but again, taking out P2, the probability of that's not the focus on this video. We have a metric for that as well. Obviously, we have the time-based statistics, also distance statistics, but we're going to get to that. So, now we mentioned it. I already mentioned it briefly, but I want to make a comment on derived probabilities, because it's important to note that we are deriving the probability of a P1, P2 flip. This means it is not correct to say that the probability of the P1, P2 flip is 21%, which is a common misinterpretation. What we're actually saying is that based on historical data, only 21% of days managed to put in a P1 as far from the daily open as the current P2. Therefore, we infer that the likelihood of P1, P2 flip occurring is low. This is a derived probability, not a direct one. While we can and do use it to derive the probability of a P1, P2 flip, it's important to understand that the nuance is that it's not correct to call this chance of P1, P2 flip. And that's also why, oftentimes I get questions, why is it not just the chance of a P1, P2 flip, like the name? Why is it so confusing? It's because it's not the chance of P1, P2 flip, right? We're using the distances from daily open to the first pivot to derive the probability of it. And it's completely fair to say, well, that it wouldn't happen much, so the probability is low, most likely, but it's not the same as a direct probability for that. It's not what we're measuring. So let's go on to the next example. I think I have an example of ETH here. Yeah, there we go. So price put in a P2 3.91% from daily open, so above it, right? We can see P2 3.91% above daily open. And what we see is that only 10.8% of days for Ethereum, right, because it's specific to the asset, only 10.8% of days have been able to put in P1 3.91% above the daily open, which is the current distance daily open to P2. That means we can once again infer the likelihood of a P1, P2 flip happening. Since we know that only 10.8% of days, right, have enough energy to put in P1 this far from daily open, so to put it in here and then smash back down again to take out the other side. So since we know that only 10.8% of days do that, we can infer that the chance of P1, P2 flip is low. Therefore, we conclude that the most probable scenario is that the current P1, which is the daily low, will hold for the remainder of the day. We see that also in this case, P1 held for the day and continued higher. There we go. Right, so P1 held, and the reason why we were able to determine that is because the first pivot's more than 3. It just rarely happens that price moves this far away from daily open and then comes back. That's only 1 in 10 days. 1 out of 10 days. So it happens, but we know that for a fact that it happens only 1 out of 10 days. And therefore, the probability is low. So let's look at one more example that has a little bit of a different output. And this one is for Phantom, FTM. So what we can see here is that we have a higher value of 56.6%. So what we see is that we have the first pivot 2.63% above the daily open, or sorry, the second pivot right now. And we can see that only 56.6% of days have a P1 that is this, or not only 56, but 56.6% of days have a P1 that is this far from daily open or further. So let me check that I'm not missing anything. Nope, not missing anything. So remember again what we're trying to do. If we know there's a low probability of a P1, P2 flip occurring, then there is a high probability that P1 will hold. Again, I know I'm repeating myself, but it's important to understand this. We can see that 56.6% of days had enough energy to put in P1 at 2.63% above daily open or further. Meaning this is not an unlikely place at all to put in a P1. Like this is not an unlikely place to put in a P1. So the conclusion of that is that we cannot confidently state that a P1, P2 flip is unlikely, at least not from the perspective of these statistics. Once again, the reason for this conclusion is that it's not at all uncommon for P1 to move this far, as we can see from the data, and then take out that P1. So since we cannot conclude there's a low probability of a P1, P2 flip, we cannot conclude that P1 is safe. This would not be a weird place to put in P1 at all in terms of distance at least, right? So this is not at all a good place to put in P1 in terms of different distance. This is also where you can see the true power of these statistics, because we see P1 at hour 0, and we know that if you view the time-based statistics, you know that hour 0 is a very popular time to put in a P1. But in this case, we can see that, well, you know, P1 is at a popular time, but the distance statistics are still indicating that this P1 would not be weird at all, or this distance would not be weird at all to put in a P1, right? It's a pretty high probability area, and therefore we can give less importance to this pivot. And that's actually the reason why I came up with these distance statistics, because the time-based statistics alone were just oftentimes you see them, well, let me put it like this, they're way stronger if there's distance involved as well, right? If it's just, if price doesn't really move, then there's a high chance of that being taken out. But we'll cover that in later videos as well. But so anyway, we can now conclude that, okay, we cannot confidently say that P1 is safe, because it's not uncommon at all for P1 to be put in at the current distance of daily open to P2, right? So this could, if this would become P1, then it's a very high probability area to do so. And we can see that actually that is what happened, right? So we took out P1, we had that P1, P2 flip. And thanks to this data, we knew not to long this or anything, because we just didn't have any confirmation yet that P1 was likely to hold. Now, there's one more thing I want to point out. A common mistake that people make is saying that high percentage of this metric, I want to emphasize, it does not equal a high chance of a P1, P2 flip. So now we have seen in multiple examples. So for example, this is a low percentage, right? Only 10.8% of days have a P1 further away than 3.98%. Now, what a lot of people do is then say, okay, well, because this is a low percentage means that there's a low chance of P1, P2 flip. What they then do is say, well, then it must be that if it's high, there must be a high chance of a P1, P2 flip. And this is not exactly correct. So what people interpret is, say this is 80%, then people say, oh, there's 80% chance of a P1, P2 flip. This is not correct. Not correct. So a high percentage value simply means we cannot confidently say that P1 is safe, which is different from saying there's a high chance of a P1 flip or P1, P2 flip. A high percentage value indicates that P1 often gets put in at the current location of P2, but it does not directly tell us the probability of a flip happening today. It merely tells us that a P1, P2 flip from there is not uncommon, so we can conclude that P1 will hold. In summary, a low percentage value, so a low percentage like this, means that there's a low chance of a P1, P2 flip. But a high percentage value simply means that we cannot rule out the possibility of a flip. Not that it is likely to happen. Of course, it's more likely to happen with a higher value, but it's not a direct relation as in that, 80% means 80% chance of P1, P2 flip, just that it's in a high probability area. So this is how we use this metric. We have now discussed all of it. Let's take an example of what is happening right now to make it just more clear. So right now we have ETH here. So if I go here and I select ETH, and I have my settings selected to take P. So you can see it immediately puts in a negative 4.1%. So right now I can see that only 10.6% of days put in a P1 that is further than how far we got now. So therefore I can conclude that it's very unlikely that this will happen, this P1, P2 flip, because only 10% of days would put in a P1 this far from the daily open. And therefore, it would be 1 out of 10 occurrence. So in this case, I can say, well, this is most likely safe and is not going to be taken out today. And obviously then you need to use other metrics, like for example, how likely is P2 going to hold? And that we're going to discuss in later videos. But for now, one thing I want to close off with is that you have this metric right here, and I'm going to have more dedicated videos on the summary pages. So don't think, if you don't get this yet, don't worry too much. But this metric right here is the exact same metric. Percent P1s with bigger distance. So we see here a list with all assets, and what we can see is the current distance of daily open to P2 for these assets and how many days had a P1 with a bigger distance. So this right here is exactly the same metric as this right here. You can see 10.6%. And here in the summary page, 10.6%. So basically what we're looking at is how likely, or just basically a collection of assets, and you can infer from this the likelihood of a P1, P2 flip. That's also why it's ordered based on this from low to high. The higher this asset is on this list, the more likely it is that P1 will hold, because historically speaking, you don't see P1, P2 flip that often from this distance. So that's something just I wanted to note real quick. Again, I'm going to have dedicated tutorials to this, but this metric can be found in an easy overview for all the assets in the summary page, and we'll go over the rest later. All right, so in the next upcoming videos, we're going to discuss the input mode, the filters, and this graph right here to discover what the likelihood is of P2 being taken out, right? Because this we used to see, okay, how likely is P1 to hold. Now we want to have some more tools in our arsenal to see how likely it is that P2 will hold. So for that, I will see you in the next videos.